Hi everyone, welcome to the second session of the day. This is PHP 8.1, what's new and changed. I will be talking about some of their bigger changes in PHP and some of the changes that might affect Drupal and other PHP websites. My name is Ayesh Karnaratne. I was born and raised in Sri Lanka. I started a website called PHP.watch around 3 years ago, and I have been writing about new changes to PHP and articles and some news about PHP. That's where I'm coming from to talk about what's new, exciting features, some of the changes and deprecations in PHP 8.1. Getting back to the topic, as you're probably aware, PHP 8.1 will be released at the end of next month. We already had three release candidates, and we already had a feature freeze. This means that we have already fixed all of the features that will be available in PHP 8.1. And we have already discussed and implemented most of the breaking changes to PHP 8.1. And now that we are talking about PHP 8.1 today, now would be a perfect time to see what's new and test out our Drupal websites to make sure they will run smoothly when we have the general availability releases for PHP 8.1. I will be talking about, for the most part of this presentation, about new features in PHP. And first and foremost, and my favorite feature here is called enums. And we will be also talking about a feature called fibers, which lets you have, which lets you run a PHP application concurrently. We also have a feature called read-only properties. There are some couple improvements with the type system in PHP, and there are some other smaller level changes here as well. We will also talk about some of the change functionality in PHP 8.1. Some of these changes can be breaking changes, depending on how you use these features in PHP. We will also take a look at some of the deprecations in PHP 8.1. Now, if you remember, I did a talk last year about what's new and changed in PHP 8.0. There were so many massive changes in PHP 8.0. Just because there were so many, we had to postpone some of the changes to PHP 8.1. And now we have all of these deprecations in this upcoming version. We will also take a look at some of the backwards compatibility issues, as in which versions will be compatible with, which Drupal versions will be compatible with PHP 8.1. We'll also take a look at how you can try out some of these new features even today. First, I will be spending most of the time on enums and fibers, because I believe they will be the ones with biggest impact with this release. I will also talk about some of the change functionality, because that's one area to keep an eye. We will also see how we test out PHP 8.1 today. This includes using Docker images or compiling PHP ourselves, and so on. So let's get to the new features. Enums, like I said before, enums are by far my favorite feature in PHP 8.1, because this is a feature that we have been trying to get into PHP for many years. Other languages like Rust and Go and TypeScript, they already have enums of some sort already. We are kind of late to the party, so to speak. But we finally have enums in PHP 8.1. Before I show you what they can do, let me take one example from Drupal itself that I think we can see where we can improve there and see the problems that enums can help us solve. This is a sample from a comment item interface. They have three members here. Each of these are class PHP class constants. So all of these constants, they belong to comment item interface. Now, the way you use these values are as a label. From this function, we have a function called node set comment status. So from this method, we pass the state of the comments. It can be comment item interface hidden, it can be closed, it can be open, but this is a lie, right? Because what we really do here is we actually pass an integer value. They are not labels, they are nothing but just a bunch of numbers. We just assigned class constants because they help us to kind of take a look at the code and see which value is which one. But for PHP, they are just numbers. This is also true, right? Because instead of calling comment item interface double colon hidden, we can also say just 0, because this is what we really do inside. And the other problem is when you need to take a list of all the values we have. Every time that you define a new class constant here, you will have to update all of the places that we use these constants, because they are not bound together. So this is example from a node comment class. To get the array of value options, you have to hard code all of these class constants again here. And if you have 50 places that you use all of these constants, you have to make sure that you will update all of them, every single one of them, every time that you add a new constant. And the signature of the set comment status method, it says, I will accept an integer. See, this is a problem, because when you say, I will accept an integer, it can be 0, 1, and 2, the values that we can deal with. But it can also be minus 10,000. It can also be 5 or 7, a value that we can't deal with, or a value that we don't really know what to do with. To fix this, what we do today is we check this incoming parameter against a list of values that we already know. So like from the example before, from the node comment class, we have to duplicate all of these constants once again and do this thing same again and again. Every time that we add a new constant, we have to update these values here. The way we try to fix this with enums is that we can contain all of these the PHP class constants we had before into a type. So what we really do here is enum is short for enumerations. We enumerate a type that we collectively call comment status, and then we give a bunch of members to this collective type, saying hidden, closed, and open. If we go back to the same comment item interface, now that we have extracted these values, all of these class constants to members of this enumerated type, we can actually get rid of these ones. From the method that says set comment status, previously we had integer. Now we can just say we will accept any comment status, sorry. And because this is a type, and PHP will always do the type checking for us, we don't have to have these duplicated values either. So we can get rid of them as well. So the advantage of using enums is we can actually simplify the code, because we don't have to duplicate all of the options we know, all of the members that we know, and we don't have to validate all the time that we update or accept a parameter. The PHP will do the type checking for us, as in if you try to pass comment status open, that's valid, because we have actually defined this member from the enumerated type comment status. But if we try to pass a value that's from a different enumerated type, or a string, null, or let's say a float value, PHP will throw a type error. See, this is the good part of this one, because we don't have to check for anything. PHP's type system will do the type checking for us, and we can simplify the code and not have to duplicate all of the options all the time, that every time that we add a new option. In fact, we already had enums of some sort in PHP, the Boolean type. You know that when you declare a parameter with the type Boolean, we know that when we say Boolean, we are actually accepting true or false. And collectively, they are known as Booleans. But if you try to pass a different value, let's say a string or a class object or an array, integers, null, all of these are invalid, and PHP can throw a type error right away. So we don't have to check every time, is this a Boolean value, is this a string? We don't have to do the type checking by ourselves. Let's take a look at so how enums work. So like I said before, enums, we start them with the keyword enum, and it can contain 0 or any number of members. So this is a perfectly valid enum. It can have 0 members, it can have 4 members, it can have 1 member, it can have 10,000 members. It doesn't really matter how many members that you have. Each of these members, these cases, we call them members. Each of these members, they behave as a subtype from the main type that we created called suit. And internally, all of these members are objects. So clubs, diamonds, spades, and hearts, all of them are objects. If we call the function is object, it will return true, because that's what they really are. But these enumerated types, they are not exactly objects. They are different from class objects. I will explain them in a few later slides. If you call more dump function, there's a new syntax to dump these enumerated types with the syntax enum and followed by the name. Enums can be namespaced. So it's pretty clear that it's pretty clean when we create an enum inside a namespace. So we can organize our enumerated types that actually belong to the right place. We don't have to define a bunch of global constants in PHP, because we can actually use namespaces. They also support autoloading. So just like PHP can try to autoload a class if the class is not loaded already, PHP will try to autoload the enum as well. Now, most of us use Composer, the autoloader from Composer. You will have to use Composer 2.1, because that's the version that supports enums in its autoloader. Composer 1.0 and all of the Composer 1 versions and Composer 2.0, they will not be working with enums. It was actually me who submitted the patch, but I don't think they will backport this feature to all the older Composer versions. So just make sure to use Composer 2.1. All of these enums, they can also contain a backed value. If you define that this enum will contain integer values or string values, you can assign a value to all of these members, all of these individual members. Now, they must be unique, because you cannot have duplicated member names. And if you decide to assign values, these values must be unique as well, because enums has a feature to get the enum type, enum object back from a string or integer. So they have to be unique, because you need to take an enumerated type back from, let's say, a database or a REST API. So these values have to be unique as well. Enums can also contain class constants. They can also contain static methods. They can contain non-static methods as well. So with static methods, you can call the static method with the prefix of the name of the enum. with a non-static methods, you have to access the member and then call the name of the method. In PHP, $this is a special variable that refers to the object in the context. This works with enums as well. If you take a look at what this $this variable is, that is the name of the member itself. Enums, they also have a special property called name. You don't have to define them there. You don't have to do anything. By default, all of the enums, enumerated types, they have a property called name. So you can access the name, all of these names, by using suit followed by 2 colons, the name of the member. It can be clubs, diamonds, spades, or hearts, and access the property name. So it will return the value here. If you have backed values, now not all of these enums, they have to have a value. It's perfectly valid to have enums with just the name, and there's no backed integer or there's no backed string. They are valid. But if you have a backed value, you can access this value using the value property. This is a summary of enums that we have, and I will show the semantics of enums, as in how they are similar to classes, to PHP classes. First, they support namespaces. Classes and enums, they both support namespaces. They also support traits. Now, the condition is that these traits must not contain any properties. They can only contain methods. They can be static or they can be non-static, but they should never have a property assigned to the trait. They also support auto-loading, like I mentioned before. They also support magic constants. Even this magic constant and double underscore clause, it also works with enums. You can also use the instance of operator. If you have a variable that you need to check against the name of the enum, you can use var instance of post status, and that actually works with enums as well. And most importantly, they support methods. It can be static methods, can be non-static methods. Enums, they support methods either way. But the difference between a class object and enumerated member is that fundamentally, an enum member is a type. So by definition, types must not contain any data, because data objects are class objects. Enums are what we use as a type. This type can contain methods, that's fine, but they must not contain any state. So if you try to set a dynamic property, if you try to declare a property, PHP will throw a fatal error saying, hey, you are not allowed to declare properties. And perhaps the most obvious difference, perhaps the most obvious difference is that if you try to compare 2 class objects, they will not be identical, because internally all of the class objects in PHP, they have an internal ID. They will not be the same. So 2 class members, even if they belong to the same class, even if they have the same properties, they will not be equal. But with enums, if you have 2 members, regardless of where they come from, you can just create this member, or you can take a member from the database value. You can take them from a log, or you can take them from, let's say, a form submission. They will be identical. So you can use them as a type, and you can also use them as a way to compare one object with another. Let's see some of the examples, right? So we have the same enum from the last time, and because we need to store them in the database, we assign them a few values. These values are the same as the class constants, so it should be familiar. This is how you would insert, let's say, an array of an entity to the database, right? This is a simple example. So what I like to show here is because we can't put this object to the database. So the database will only accept an integer. That's why we have defined this integer here. And just before we send this value to the database, we access the value property, which will return 0, 1, or 2. So we can actually store them in the database. If you want to take them from the database, let's say we need to look for all the entities with the status being something, we can access the value of the status. First, we refer to the name of the enum, followed by the name of the member, which is here, and followed by the value here. So this is to what the database says is to select entity ID from my table where status is equal to the integer 2. Another example is imagine we have a form submission, and from the form submission, what we actually get is number 1, 2, or 0. So we can use this special method called from. So comment status is the name of the enum, and from is from the enum implementation. We don't have to declare this method by ourselves. And then state is the integer value. And this from method will return an enumerator object back if there is a value that that matches this value. There's also a method called try from that will return that will return null if there's no such enum with the backed value. But this from method will throw an exception saying there's no enumerated member with this backed value. So that's it for enums. This is a rather lengthy talk, and I had to just like gloss through some of these details because yesterday I did the talk just on enums. So I hope you can see the scope of the enums. But at the end of the session, I have a bunch of links that that might help to take the bigger picture. But I hope I could explain enums and how useful they can be. Next up is fibers. So fibers are a way to bring concurrency to PHP. And here, what we mean by concurrency is that you can have any number of execution contexts. So for example, you can have the main thread that will be doing some sort of task, and then it can stop doing that and then start another task somewhere else. And then that task can decide to pass back to the main thread. So if it wants, it can keep going. So all of the time, there will be just one task that's running, but you can change the context. This is different. Concurrency is different from running a software in parallel. When you say concurrency, it means it can have any number of threads, but there will be only one execution. With parallel, what it means is that there can be multiple processes that run at the same time. But fibers can help other extensions to have parallel execution. For example, extensions like Swool. It can already run parallel applications with PHP, and fibers will help them to build, fibers will help them to be more like a base layer to build all these features in the future. Normally, the execution flow is linear. This is what we have been doing with PHP for all these years. With concurrent execution, we can actually take the tasks to a separate context. So these variables between this thread and this thread, you can maintain these values, and you can switch between the first task and the second task and any number of tasks that you have to make it more efficient, or if you want to pass values between. It's totally possible to share values. So it's possible from the main thread to pass some data to the fiber, and it's possible to pass some data back to the main task from the fiber. With fibers, we would start the program normally, and at some point we can create a new fiber. Just when we create new fiber, we don't actually start to execute this fiber, but at some point we can decide to start the fiber, and once we start the fiber, we will be executing the code from the fiber, and the fiber can decide to suspend and give the control back to the main thread. The main thread can decide to resume if it wants to, and the fiber will be started once again. The fiber can suspend, and that's how you switch the task between the main thread and the fiber. And you can just keep going. To use fibers, there's a new class called fiber in PHP 8.1, which accepts a callback. This can be a Lambda function, this can be an invocable option, invocable object, it can be a function name, anything that we make it to be a callable. Inside this callable, it can contain a method called suspend, and when we call suspend inside the fiber, it will stop the execution and give the process back to the main thread. So we have this just sample program. I will try to go through how PHP would execute this. So from the start, we have echo main started. So on the screen, you will be seeing main started. And then we define the fiber. Like I said before, when you create the fiber, it's not started right away. So you have to start this by yourself. So you will not see an input here, but once you start the fiber, then PHP will go back to the fiber and start the execution from there, from the top. So this is where we call echo fiber started. So you can see the output here, and here we actually suspend this fiber. So what this essentially means is that we go back to the same place that we started the fiber and then try to execute from there. So in here we call fiber returned. So you can see this value here, and at any point you can resume the same fiber. The difference between calling, let's say, a function and resuming a fiber is that fiber can start from where it left off. So if you call, let's say, a method or function, it will start from the top. But with fiber, all the variables that it creates will be still there. All the iterators and all the things that were there inside the fiber, it will be still there, and it will continue from where it left off. And finally, we call fiber ended. So this is where this is how the flow of fibers works. Fiber class itself is pretty self-explanatory, but I try to explain the most simple use case. If you'd like to read more, there's a link here that explains and shows some examples on how to make the best use of fibers. And next up, we have read-only properties. The idea with a read-only property is that once you define that a property is read-only, you can write to the property just once, and you can never override these values. Let's see an example. So we have this class called user, and this property is called UID that holds an integer. If we define that this is a read-only value, you cannot override this value ever. So from here, we store a value to the UID property, and if you try to assign the value once again at any point of the PHP program, PHP will throw a fatal error because, hey, this is a read-only property. You are not allowed to override this. So this gives some sort of protection against modifying a property without having to check for all the valid entry points and all the use cases. It's also not possible to initialize a value outside the class. So if you have a read-only property, even if it says public here, no one can write to a public property because this is read-only. So to write to a read-only property, which you can do just once, it has to be from inside the class. And we also have some time system improvements. Sorry. The first is intersection types. The idea is that you can combine 2 or 3, any number of types using the ampersand, and this becomes a type itself. This is similar to unit types in PHP 8.0. So when we have iterator and countable, what it really means is that all these parameters passed to this function, they must implement iterator and countable. So this type itself, the only values that it accepts are classes that implement iterator or countable. It doesn't have to be from the same class. It can be inherited, but it has to implement both of these types. We also have a type called never. This is similar to void type. So in PHP 7.0, we have a type called void, which means that this function will never return a value. Never type takes a step further, and it says this function will never execute from this point. So if you define that the function with the return type never, what it essentially means is that from this function, I will exit this PHP program. So PHP, if you try to return or if you try to continue from here, PHP will throw an exception saying this function is declared with the return type never, so it should never return anything or resume the program. We also have a few other new features. I don't really have the full 45 minutes to explain all of these features, so that's why I decided to talk about fibers, enums, and read-only properties. But we have a few new functions in PHP 8.0, some functions to encrypt PHP using different algorithms. We have a couple hashing algorithms which are ridiculously fast. I did a benchmark, and there are like the fastest hashing algorithms we have in PHP. It's also possible to access the full path of a file upload. This essentially enables us to enable directory uploads if the browser supports it. We will also take a look at the change functionality. So as you probably know, PHP doesn't really follow semantic versioning. So just because we go from 8.0 to 8.1, it doesn't mean that we will never have any breaking changes. In contrast to, say, Symfony, if you use Symfony 5.1 and 5.2, they will not contain any breaking changes. They can deprecate certain functionality, but they will not break any of the existing functionality. Now, PHP 8.1 has some functionality that can break websites. The first is the tentative return types. This is a progress that we go from many years back to add proper types to PHP classes, interfaces, and functions. So what we have today is interfaces and classes and all these functions without return types, because return types were added in PHP 7.0, and almost all of these interfaces, they come from PHP 5 era. So if we add return types, it can instantly break most of the websites. So as a solution, we have tentative return types, which means they are here for information purposes, but they will be added in the next major PHP version, which is PHP 9. So what we did here is, instead of declaring a PHP document with the return type, we actually assigned the return types, but they are not enforced. So if you have a class that has no return type or has a return type that does not match here, so here we are saying the offset exist should be a Boolean, but here we don't have a return type. This is a violation of the class signatures, the method signatures. So as a middle ground, PHP will now will now emit a deprecation notice saying the signatures don't match. So you will have to fix this by adding the return type if that's possible. Now, you cannot use return types unless you require PHP 7.0. So some of their PHP applications, like WordPress, they still have to support PHP 5.6. So the solution is to add an attribute that says return type will change. So PHP will stop giving this deprecation notice, but it will still enforce this restriction once PHP 9.0 is released. So this works as a middle ground until we get our feet on PHP, a recent PHP version. There are also changes with the globals variable. This variable is what we use to hold all the global variables. We don't have to do this, but this is a very old pattern. Even Drupal 7 has some global variables that, such as the global user variable. This variable is not deprecated, but if you try to override this variable, or if you try to modify this value as a whole, PHP will now throw a fatal error saying you are not allowed to modify this array as a whole. You can still modify individual items, but if you try to make something that are drastic or that tries to override this globals variable, it will not throw a fatal error. It's also not possible to create a reference to the globals variable. So this could be a problem in existing sites that rely on the globals variable. If you don't have these global variables anywhere in your code, you're perfectly good to go. We also have some changes with resource to object migrations. We have been doing this for many years now. PHP 8.0, they had some changes as well. So the idea is that the resource type, PHP has the type called resources. If you open file that's using the open function, that's a resource. If you create a database connection, that's a resource. We try to slowly get rid of these resource objects in favor of class objects. We changed a bunch of these resource types in PHP 8.0, and we continue to do this in PHP 8.1 as well. But most of these changes, it's very unlikely that they will break existing websites, because the way all of the functions that used to return resources, now they return a class object. All the functions that used to accept a resource type, now they accept a class object. So this upgrade is pretty seamless for the most part. The difference is that PHP has a function called isResource that used to return true for resources, but this function no longer returns true for these class objects. So if you rely on isResource function, now you might need to see if it continues to work. If you download slides, all of these are actual links that you can take a look at what actually changed and how you can try to validate a variable to be a valid resource or a valid class object. Next up is deprecations, which are plenty. Now, I mentioned these 3 deprecations that are very likely to come if you have, let's say, a site that used to work with PHP 5.5, 5.6. The first 3 deprecations, they are likely the most, let's say, annoying deprecations to run into. The second one is from the last change, the tentative. Sorry, the second one is from tentative return types. So this is that deprecation. With PHP internal functions such as string replace functions or most of the string functions, array functions, it was possible to pass null as a default value. But with PHP 8.1, unless this function is declared as that it accepts a null value, if you try to pass null, now it will emit a deprecation notice. It's also a problem with PHP 8.1 if you try to create an array from, let's say, a null value or a false value. This is what we used to do, and this is especially a problem with Drupal because we rely on arrays for the most part. For the rendering arrays, the form arrays, most of them are arrays. So if you relied on PHP to create an array automatically from a null value or from a false value, it will emit a deprecation notice here as well. The fourth one is a serializable interface. PHP 9, we actually had I think a few places that this deprecation notice was a trouble, but the work is on the way. There are more changes and more deprecation changes, but they belong to some of the functionality that nobody hardly used, or functionality that were broken or in one way or another. Speaking of backwards compatibility, we know that Drupal 8.9 and all the Drupal 8 versions, they will no longer receive support after November 2021. If you remember, PHP 8.1 will be released on November. So if you use any Drupal 8 website, that's a bad idea in the first place, but also you will not be receiving fixes for PHP 8.1. So now would be a perfect time to update your Drupal websites. Drupal 7, it will return support until November 2022. So if there are any problems with the Drupal 7, they will be fixed by the maintainers, which Drupal 7 has a very good maintainer now. And myself and many people will try to submit changes and go there. If you like to help, you can go to the Drupal issue queue or issue queue of any project in for that matter. There's a tag there's a tag called PHP 8.1. You can file a new bug if you find any bugs there. You can search for existing ones using this tag. So you can be aware of the compatibility issues with Drupal core and modules and things. Let's see how we can try out PHP 8 today. The easiest way is to use this website called eval. That's 3v4l.org. You can just type the code and run it on the browser. You don't have to compile PHP by yourself. It's probably the easiest way to do this. The PHP Daily, they also publish Docker images, well, daily, as the name stands, with the latest versions. So you can use the Docker image and run the PHP applications. If you use Windows, you can download the compiled binaries from this URL. Make sure to download the 64-bit version, which will likely be the one that you need. And PHP is compiled with VS16. So if you use Apache, you have to make sure that you use VS16 here as well. If you like to compile PHP by yourself, you can do this as well. I have written pretty extensive guides on Ubuntu and Fedora, Red Hat, and CentOS, which are linked here. And finally, I have a list of resources that might help. I've been spending many months on documenting the changes in PHP. And I wrote an article about every single change in PHP 8.1. So this is just a gist of what will be changing in PHP. But there's a whole lot more if you'd like to read about it. Finally, if you have any questions, I have 10 seconds. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I will be on the chat here as well. Or you can find me on Twitter. And finally, thanks to everyone. Thanks to the Drupal Association. Thanks to you for attending. The people who work with live captioning, everyone, thank you so much for making this happen. And happy 20th birthday to Drupal.